a rising interest rate environment, and therefore is showing restraint both at a fiscal level and also from a standpoint of being able to support that economically. And that would point at the Australian dollar and to a lesser extent the euro. There are problems with both of them as a buy the currency and walk away kind of transaction, though, because the Australian economy is largely dependent upon China staying in one piece, and I don't think they're going to. And, of course, the European currency, the euro, has all kinds of issues going on right now with Greece and Portugal and Ireland and everything else. As trades in and out, they're fine, and there's a great deal of money to be made there. But I believe that what you're going to see here over the next 6 to 12 months is that the federal government and the Federal Reserve are going to be forced to pull system liquidity out. And as they do so, you're going to see a ferocious rebound bounce in the dollar, and those currencies are going to get hit. So, and this is one of the things I put up in my 2011 predictions. Things are pretty much going along as I expected them to. You're late in the trade on this, and I'd be a little careful here because there's a lot of stress showing up in places. For example, China is tightening aggressively, and they just ran a set of stress tests with an anticipation of 50% real estate price declines. That's not something that is typically associated with wildly expanding speculative leverage in an economy. So I would be a little careful. Again, if you're going to trade them, that's fine. But as a place to kind of put your money and say, okay, goodbye, I think that's a mistake. One possible exception to that could be Canada. I think Canada is potentially in a little bit more of a stable situation. They have a decent set of assets in the form of petroleum and other natural resources, and the one advantage they have is that they're resource rich and people poor, and that's a good position to be in as a country.
Thank you for your perspective.
Okay, and our next question will be for a forum member, and it will be coming from Giuseppe.
Hi, Carl. Welcome. This question is from our member Green Meadow, and I'm going to read it for her. The way it goes is, commodity prices are skyrocketing. How much of this speculation are just people wanting some place to put their money that will hold value?
I think you have to be very careful with commodities as things stand right now. You can look at a chart of silver, which is the mother lode of this of the expression of this at the present time. There's a lot of people out there that believe that gold and silver as a pair are essentially monetary metals and are reflecting the safety and soundness kind of trade. My retort to that is that if in fact gold and silver are money, then why is it that they are going up in price at several multiples of the rate at which the dollar is declining in value as measured against, for example, oil or some other basket of commodities like wheat or oats or soybeans? I think the answer is a little bit more complicated than that. I think what you have there is that those monetary metals in particular are behaving as if they are leveraged instruments, even though they are not. And that's extremely dangerous because people get sucked into them. We've seen this happen before. In the early 1980s, we had, of course, the Hunt brothers took a run at silver, and gold shot the moon at the time up into the 800s and then subsequently collapsed. And everybody believed at the time that the U.S. dollar was going to go to zero and that the United States was going to suffer hyperinflation. Of course, that didn't happen. And what you had instead was gold went from 800 to 300 and change in a relatively short period of time. I look at gold more as a geopolitical instability hedge, and I think that if you were to take a look at the timeline from when the Iranians decided they were going to grab some of our people, and then when Ronald Reagan was elected, and you kind of overlaid those two events on the 1980s gold price chart, you would see something rather revealing.
Okay. She also has a follow-up on this, and the question is, how much of this rising commodity prices are due to debased or devalued currencies, and how much are shortages?
I don't think any of it's shortages. You can take a look at the storage at Cushing, Oklahoma, which is where oil is delivered in the United States. There are people that argue that it's a matter of where the oil is versus where it needs to go. I've heard that argument. I disagree with it. anytime that you have a large amount of a commodity in storage somewhere, someone can find a way to ship it from point A to point B if they can make that work. So I would go the other way on that. I would say that there's a large degree of speculation. There are a lot of people that are placing what amount to end of the world trades in the commodities, not just in gold and silver, but also in oil and some of the other commodities. And I think that's a terrible mistake. Oil, to some degree, by the way, is being supported by the unrest in the Middle East, and you cannot discount that. I mean, the idea, everybody says Libya is such a small producer of oil. That may be true, but Libyan oil is some of the highest quality crude available in the marketplace. So there is a outsized impact from the Libyan unrest that has not so much to do with the quantity, but to do with the quality of what they produce. There are very few sources for light sweet crude that are of equal quality to Libya's. And there are a number of refineries that are not set up to eat anything else. So, shortages are a kind of a funny thing. Everyone thinks a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil, and that's not really quite true.
Thank you.
Okay. Karl, contrary to the popular perspective that is frequently espoused on mainstream media, many of our forum's members believe that economic conditions are deteriorating rather than improving, and we'd like to get your take on this. In your writings, you point to massive imbalances economically and financially. To get to these economic and financial conditions, the U.S. and global economies that they're in today required years, decades even, of errors, misestimation, poor judgment, and influences or policies at different levels. What, in your opinion, are the key drivers that got us to the conditions where we are today, and what will drive the dislocations that eventually lead to a resetting or resolution of these imbalances?
Well, I would have to agree with your members of the forum that say that the economy is getting worse and not better. I don't see how anybody can look at what's been going on over the last 3 or 4 years and find improvement in the actual underlying economic numbers. Just as one example, we have employment statistics that come out every month. In order for us to actually show positive employment as a percentage of the population, we have to post about 150,000 new jobs on a monthly basis. That's each and every month, and that's just simply from the number of people that come into the workforce. We obviously have not been doing this. So, and I graph that out every month in the participation rate. When you look at the hourly earnings, when you look at the the amount of overtime, the average hours worked, none of these statistics are showing any meaningful increase. They're bouncing around up and down a few points here and there and have been for the last year and a half. But there's no substantial improvement. When you take a look at things like the, they talk about the savings rate, but they're not being honest about this. The savings rate is not what people put aside. They take your income and then they subtract your expenses, and the rest is savings. Well, if you're paying debt off, that counts as savings. Now, the last time I looked, you're not saving anything if you're paying a credit card. So there's a lot of distortions that are out there. These policies took 30 years to come to fruition and provide the dislocation that we had in 2007. We started with the errors on a macro level and on a policy level in the 1980s with Continental Illinois, when the FDIC chose to bail out the bondholders instead of just paying the depositors off. This is where the market got the idea that you could buy the debt of any bank, no matter what size it was, no matter how big, no matter how small, and you would not lose any money, no matter how stupid that bank's executives were. And in the case of Continental Illinois, they bought very bad loans from a failed bank in Oklahoma. It was called Penn Square, I believe, that had written a lot of paper during the time that oil prices were extremely high. Oil then collapsed in price. Those loans were worthless. They purchased them without doing any kind of diligence on them at all. They actually had at least one of their executives, I believe, came under indictment, although I don't recall if he actually went to jail. And yet the people who invested money in that bank by buying their bonds were bailed out by the FDIC, and that can be very easily argued was a violation of the charter. So we spent the next 25 years essentially allowing people to do the same sort of nonsense. You could buy Lehman's debt, for example, and you were not going to take any substantial haircut. You could buy Bear Stearns debt. You were not going to take any substantial haircut. We get into this situation here. You've got Goldman Sachs, you've got Morgan Stanley, you've got Merrill Lynch, all these institutions. And hey, guess what? The only one that actually went kaboom was Lehman. And out of those, there's very little in the way of actual losses that flowed through to investors. And so we built this model where institutions could do things that were demonstrably unsound, i.e. claiming they had debt covered with a credit default swap when the person they bought them from didn't have any money to pay. And when that became exposed, nobody went to jail for selling that instrument as a bogus instrument. Nobody got prosecuted for selling what amounted to insurance that they had no money behind. Okay, and in fact, 10 years prior, the financial marketplace had managed to conjure up laws that said that the states could not police these things as insurance contracts. So we've blown a huge debt bubble over the space of 30 years. The idea that we can somehow get out of this without people having to take their medicine is ludicrous. It's not going to happen. And yet that's been the entire mantra throughout this, is that, well, we can't hurt the economy. We can't hurt the recovery. We have to do this deficit spending. Well, folks, 12% of gross domestic product last calendar year was conjured out of thin air by the federal government handing money to people. So if you look at the classical economic definition of depression, it's a 10% decline in GDP from top to bottom. If you look at it from that perspective, we have been in an economic depression for the last 3 years. And there's no evidence that it's going to end anytime soon.
So what is it that's going to happen? Is it the bond market is going to call Ben Bernanke and Timothy Geithner's bluff? And are they actually going to say, no, we don't trust you. You guys are not telling the truth, and Congress will never tell the truth with respect to the unified budget, the budget, you guys are not going to be able to get this done. Is that where the dislocation is going to come from?
I think the dislocation comes from one of two places. Either we take our medicine in a controlled form, which means that Congress stands up and tells someone has to get in front of a microphone essentially and tell the American people, look, we know we made promises to you in the form of specifically Medicare and Medicaid and other forms of public assistance. They were lies. We do not have the money. We will find some way to help to the extent that we're able, but we do not have the money to keep the promises we made. And we're going to have to adjust both what the government provides and also what the government raises in the form of revenue. The idea that we can tax our way out of this is ludicrous. As you start to raise taxes, you get avoidance behavior, and the total amount of revenue actually can, in some cases, go down. So there is that problem. The other thing, of course, is that if you take $1 worth of taxes out of somebody's pocket, they can't spend that dollar in the economy. So you're going to have a direct hit to GDP if you attempt to fund these deficits through increased taxation. If you cut the deficit spending back, you will also have a direct hit to GDP, because as you stop the spending, you are not borrowing all this money and throwing it into the economy. So again, you have the same direct hit to GDP. The other alternative, though, if we don't do this, and this is the one that I'm concerned about, is that we continue to push the envelope to the point that something breaks. We already broke one nation. We broke Egypt. Okay? We doubled their cost of food and other necessities in the space of 18 months. This was a nation that had a per capita GDP in the couple $1,000 a year per person range. Those people are literally surviving, spending essentially all of their money on food and fuel. You turn around and you double their expenditures, their belly starts to growl. When a man's belly growls loudly enough, he riots. And that's the mechanics of what occurred here. Of course, Bernanke disclaims any blame for this.